The Widow. On the edge. The sun hung low over Sagebrush Gulch, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of copper and dust. Ruby Mayfield stood at her kitchen window, watching the light fade across the prairie grass that stretched endlessly beyond her property line. At 26, she had already lived more lifetimes than most women her age wife, widow, and now something else entirely that the townspeople couldn't quite name. She adjusted the black lace veil that covered her face, a habit born not from mourning but from necessity. The veil kept the questions at bay, kept the stares from lingering too long on features that drew too much attention in a town where being beautiful and alone was almost as dangerous as being guilty of something. It had been 8 months since Eli died. 8 months since that terrible night when the rain pounded against the windows and his fists had pounded against her ribs for the last time. The town believed he'd fallen from Devil's Ridge while checking on his oil shale claims after too much whiskey. Ruby let them believe it. The truth was buried deeper than any oil deposit how he'd cornered her in their own kitchen, how she'd pushed with every ounce of strength left in her bruised body, how the back door had given way and sent him tumbling backward into the storm and over the cliff's edge. The seamstress shop she ran from the front room of her small house provided enough income to keep her fed and respectable. Women came for alterations and new dresses, speaking to her through the veil with a mixture of pity and wariness. Men kept their distance entirely, which suited Ruby fine. She'd learned that a woman alone was either prey or predator in the eyes of most, and she refused to be either. As twilight settled over the land, Ruby noticed something that made her hand pause on the coffee pot. Smoke, a thin tendril rising from the cottonwood grove that marked the eastern boundary of her property. Someone had made camp. Her fingers found the Winchester rifle mounted beside the door, checking the action with practiced ease. Eli had taught her to shoot during their courtship, back when his hands had been gentle and his promises had seemed true. It was perhaps the only useful thing he'd ever given her. Ruby stepped onto the porch, her boots clicking against the weathered boards. The summer evening carried the scent of sage and distant rain. She could see the campfire now, glowing orange through the trees. Travelers sometimes passed through, but they usually kept to the main road, not venturing onto private land. "Hello there," she called out, her voice carrying firm across the distance. "You're on private property." The movement by the fire stilled. Then a figure rose, hands visible and empty. "Evening, ma'am. I apologize for the trespass. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. I was hoping to rest him before pushing on to town come morning." The man stepped into clearer view, and Ruby's grip on the rifle tightened instinctively. He was tall, lean in the way of men who lived in the saddle, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen too many miles. A cowboy, by the look of him, though something in his bearing suggested more than just cattle drives and campfire coffee. "Town's only 3 miles west," Ruby said. "You could walk it." "Could," he agreed, not moving closer. "But my horse is lame, and I won't leave him. I've got money if you're willing to rent that patch of ground for the night. I'll be gone with first light." Ruby studied him through her veil. His hands remained visible, palms out in the universal gesture of harmlessness. But she'd learned that the most dangerous men often appeared the most harmless. "There's an old hay shed behind the barn," she heard herself saying. "You can bed down there. No fires inside. There's a pump for water. I'll expect you gone by sunrise." "Much obliged, ma'am. Name's Jack Coulter." She didn't offer her own name. Didn't need to. Everyone within 50 miles knew the widow Mayfield, the woman who wore mourning veils 8 months after her husband's death, who lived alone on the edge of town like some figure from a cautionary tale. "I'll bring your horse some grain," she added, surprising herself. "No animal should suffer for its rider's misfortune." She saw him smile slightly in the dying light. "That's kind of you." Ruby turned without another word and went back inside, hanging the rifle in its place but keeping it loaded. Through the window, she watched him lead a limping bay mare toward the shed, talking to the animal in low, soothing tones. The way a man treated his horse said much about his character. Eli used to claim. He'd always been rough with the bits and heavy with the spurs. She filled a bucket with oats from her own supply and carried it out to the shed. The cowboy Jack Coulter had already unsaddled his horse and was examining the injured hoof by lantern light. "Stone bruise," he said without looking up. "Few days' rest should see her right." Ruby set the bucket down and stepped back. Up close, she could see the wear on him more clearly. A scar along his jaw that looked like shrapnel, the kind of steady hands that came from facing danger and surviving it. His eyes, when he glanced up at her, were gray as winter sky. "I'll be out of your way come morning," he said again. "See that you are." But as Ruby walked back to her house, she had the strangest feeling that morning would bring something other than his departure. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, and for the first time in 8 months, the sound didn't feel quite so lonely. Inside, she prepared her simple supper beans and cornbread, strong coffee, and found herself setting aside an extra portion. Hospitality was bred deep in frontier bones, even when wisdom counseled against it. She wrapped the food in a cloth and left it on the porch step, knocking once on the post to alert him. When she looked out an hour later, the plate was back on the step, empty and clean. A small bunch of prairie flowers lay beside it, evening primrose and wild aster, tied with a strand of grass. Ruby picked them up, studying them in the lamplight. It had been a long time since anyone had given her flowers, even longer since she'd wanted them. She placed them in a glass of water on the kitchen table and prepared for bed, checking the locks twice, the rifle within reach. Outside, she could hear the soft nickering of horses, the creak of hay-shed boards as someone settled for the night. Ruby blew out the lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of her empty house. But tonight, there was something else. The knowledge that another human being breathed and lived just yards away. It should have frightened her. Should have sent her reaching for the rifle. Instead, she found herself thinking of gray eyes and gentle hands, of a man who wouldn't leave an injured horse. Dangerous thoughts for a woman with secrets. But the prairie night was long, and sometimes the weight of solitude pressed heavier than the weight of risk. Tomorrow, he would leave. Tomorrow, she would return to her careful existence behind black veils and locked doors. But tonight, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to not be alone, to share the burden of surviving in this hard land with someone who understood that survival often came at a cost. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. Far off, thunder rolled across the plains, promising rain by morning. Ruby closed her eyes and tried not to think about gray eyes and steady hands. Tried not to wonder if Jack Coulter carried his own ghosts across the endless miles. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of prairie flowers and the sound of someone else's heartbeat in the darkness beyond her walls. He rode with a storm. The thunder that had prowled the horizon all night finally broke loose just after dawn. Ruby woke to the sound of rain hammering against her roof and the restless stomping of horses in the shed. She dressed quickly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders before venturing onto the porch. The cowboy was already up, standing in the doorway of the hay shed with his injured mare. The rain had turned the yard to mud, and dark clouds pressed low against the prairie, promising this was no passing shower. "Storm looks to be settling in," Jack Coulter called across the yard, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "I'd move on, but Belle here can barely put weight on that hoof." Ruby studied the sky with practiced eyes. Living alone had taught her to read weather like scripture. This had the look of a 3-day blow, the kind that turned roads to rivers and made travel treacherous even for healthy horses. "Bring her into the barn," she said finally. "No sense keeping an injured animal in a drafty shed." He hesitated. "I don't want to impose." "You already have." She turned back inside. "Might as well keep the horse dry while you're at it." Through the kitchen window, she watched him lead the mare across the muddy yard, speaking to her in that same low voice. The horse limped badly, favoring her right front hoof. Ruby had seen plenty of stone bruises in her time. Eli had kept 3 horses, all of them high-strung and prone to lameness. This would need several days of rest, storm or no storm. She put coffee on to boil and pulled out the makings for breakfast. If the man was staying, he'd need feeding. It was simple frontier arithmetic. A hungry man was an unpredictable man, and she had enough uncertainty in her life already. When the knock came at her back door, she was ready with a plate of biscuits and salt pork, a mug of black coffee. She opened the door just wide enough to pass them through. "Much obliged," he said. Up close in the gray morning light, she could see the fatigue etched deep in his features. The scar along his jaw stood out pale against weathered skin. "I've got money." "Keep it. Just tend your horse and move on when the weather breaks." He studied her through the veil, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that he saw more than she intended to show. "You always this hospitable to strange men who camp on your property. You always ask so many questions of women kind enough to feed you." That almost got a smile. "Fair enough, ma'am. I'll keep to the barn." But as the day wore on and the storm intensified, Ruby found herself drawn to the window repeatedly. She could see him moving about the barn, tending not just his mare but her old plow horse, Samson. When she went out to gather eggs from the hen house, she found he'd already collected them, leaving the basket covered on her porch step. The rain continued, turning the world beyond her windows into a gray blur. She worked on a dress for Mrs. Patterson, letting the familiar rhythm of needle and thread calm her nerves. But her thoughts kept drifting to the stranger in her barn, Jack Coulter. The name had a Texas sound to it, and his accent confirmed it, a slow drawl softened by miles of travel. Around midday, she made a decision that surprised her. Wrapping herself in an oilcloth slicker, she made her way to the barn with another plate of food and a pot of coffee. He was sitting on a hay bale, working saddle soap into his tack with methodical strokes. The barn smelled of horses and leather, rain drumming steadily on the roof. He stood when she entered, removing his hat reflexively. "You don't need to do that," she said, setting the food on a barrel. "Do what?" "Act like I'm some lady deserving of manners. I'm just a widow with a barn you're borrowing." He looked at her for a long moment. "In my experience, being widowed doesn't make a woman less deserving of respect. Usually the opposite." Ruby didn't know what to say to that. She turned to check on Samson, running her hand along the old horse's neck. "You're good with animals. They're simpler than people, more honest about what they need. Is that why you chose the life riding alone? No ties to hold you down?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Sometimes ties get cut for you. After that, staying alone just seems safer." There was something in his voice, a weight that matched her own. Ruby found herself really looking at him for the first time, not just the surface details of a drifting cowboy, but the deeper signs, the way he held himself slightly favoring his left side, like an old injury that ached in the rain, the careful distance he maintained, never crowding her space, the calluses on his hands that spoke of more than just rope and reins. "You were in the war," she said. It wasn't a question. "Arizona Territory, Apache campaigns, mostly." He went back to his saddle work. "You?" "My husband came back different than he left." The words slipped out before she could stop them. She never talked about Eli, especially not the truth of him. War does that to some men, brings out what was already there, hidden under civilized behavior. Ruby's hand stilled on Samson's mane. "That's a peculiar thing to say." "Is it?" He looked up at her then, those gray eyes steady. "I've known plenty of men who use their service as an excuse for cruelty, like the war gave them permission to be what they always were underneath." The barn suddenly felt smaller, the rain louder. Ruby took a step back. "I should go. There's mending waiting." "Ma'am, Mrs. Mayfield." She stopped at the sound of her name. Of course he knew it. Everyone knew the widow Mayfield. "I'll be moving on soon as this weather breaks, But if you need anything while I'm here fixing something, heavy work, you just have to ask." "I don't need anything from anyone," she said, more sharply than intended. "No," he agreed quietly. "I don't expect you do, but the offer stands just the same." Ruby fled back to the house, her heart racing for reasons she didn't care to examine. Inside, she stripped off the wet slicker and stood shaking in her kitchen, not from cold, but from something else. The way he'd spoken about war and cruelty, like he understood. The careful respect that had nothing to do with her being a lady and everything to do with recognizing another wounded creature. She spent the afternoon attacking her mending with violent precision, trying not to think about gray eyes and scarred hands. The storm raged on, and she told herself she was grateful for the rain that kept him in the barn, kept this strange disruption to her ordered life at a safe distance. But when evening came and she prepared her simple supper, she found herself making extra again. This time, when she left the covered plate on the porch, she included a jar of preserves from last summer's berries and a chunk of soap she'd made herself lavender and lye, good for working dirt from tired hands. The plate came back clean as before, but this time there was something else, a small wooden figure, no bigger than her thumb, a horse carved with surprising skill from what looked like a piece of barn board. She turned it over in her hands, marveling at the tiny details, the flowing mane, the proud arch of neck. Ruby set the carving on her mantel and tried not to think about what it meant, tried not to wonder about the hands that had shaped it, or why a drifting cowboy would carry the skill for such delicate work. Tried not to admit that for the first time in 8 months, her house didn't feel quite so empty. The storm showed no signs of breaking. Tomorrow would bring more rain, more awkward proximity to this man who saw too much and asked too little. But tonight, she allowed herself one small rebellion against wisdom. She moved the wooden horse to her bedside table where she could see it in the lamplight, a tiny reminder that even in the midst of storms, someone had thought to create something beautiful. Outside, the rain continued its assault on the prairie, washing away roads and certainties alike. And in the barn, a man who'd ridden 1,000 miles to avoid connection sat working leather and wondering why a veiled widow's voice carried the same careful emptiness he heard in his own. Threads and thunder. The rain entered its 3rd day with no sign of mercy. Ruby stood at her cutting table, scissors poised over deep blue fabric that reminded her of evening sky. Mrs. Henderson's daughter needed a dress for the harvest dance, an event still 2 months away, but frontier women planned hope far in advance. Through the window, she could see Jack working on the fence line that separated her property from the wild prairie beyond. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and he'd taken advantage of it to repair sections that had been sagging since spring. She hadn't asked him to. He'd simply appeared with hammer and nails, setting about the work as if it were natural as breathing. A crack of thunder made her jump, scissors slipping. The fabric tore wrong, ruining the bodice piece she'd carefully measured. "Damnation," she muttered, then caught herself. Ladies didn't curse, though she wondered sometimes what the point of being a lady was when there was no one around to notice. As if summoned by her frustration, a knock came at the back door. She found Jack standing there, water dripping steadily from his hat brim. "Saw your lamp burning late last night and again early this morning," he said. "Thought you might need wood split for the stove." Ruby glanced at the dwindling wood pile beside her door. She'd been meaning to split more but had been avoiding the task. The axe was heavy, and the motion reminded her too much of other violent movements. "I can manage," she said automatically. "I'm sure you can." He didn't move. "But seeing as I'm eating your food and sheltering in your barn, I'd like to earn my keep, unless you prefer I stay idle." There was something in the way he said it, not challenging exactly, but understanding, like he knew what it cost her to accept help and was trying to make it easier. "The axe is in the shed," she said finally. She returned to her sewing, trying to salvage the ruined fabric. Through the window, she watched him work. He split wood with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice, steady and rhythmic despite whatever old injury made him favor his left side. The pile grew quickly, neat and properly sized for her stove. When he knocked again an hour later, she had coffee ready. "Come in out of the rain," she said, surprising herself. "No sense standing on the porch like a beggar." He hesitated at the threshold. "I'm muddy." "There's a boot jack by the door." She turned her back while he dealt with his boots, busying herself with cups and saucers. When she turned around, he was standing in stocking feet on her rag rug, looking uncomfortably large in her small kitchen. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the table. He chose the chair that kept his back to the wall and gave him a clear view of both doors. A careful man's choice. Ruby poured coffee, then settled across from him with her own cup. "That's fine work," he said, nodding toward the half-finished dress draped over her sewing table. "It pays the bills. More than that, takes skill to make something beautiful from raw cloth." Ruby found herself really looking at the dress for the first time in months. She'd been sewing by rote, filling orders without seeing what she created. But he was right, the blue fabric would catch lamplight at the dance, would make young Sissy Henderson feel pretty and grown up for perhaps the first time. "My mother was a seamstress," Jack continued. "Back in Tennessee, before we moved to Texas, she tried to teach me, said a man should know how to mend his own clothes. I was too stubborn to learn properly. Tennessee to Texas is a long journey. My father had dreams of cattle in space, died of fever 6 months after we arrived. Mother took in sewing to keep us fed. Tough woman, tougher than my father. In the end," Ruby traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. "The frontier requires that of women, being tougher than we thought possible." "What brought you out here, if you don't mind my asking?" She did mind, but found herself answering anyway. "My husband, Eli, had investments in oil shale. Thought he'd make a fortune." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. The only thing he found was disappointment and whiskey. Hard combination. "Yes," the word came out barely above a whisper. Lightning flashed, followed immediately by thunder that shook the windows. Ruby flinched, coffee sloshing. Jack's hand moved as if to reach for her, then stopped halfway across the table. "Just weather," he said quietly. "I know." But her hands were shaking. Thunder had always unsettled her. But since that night, the night Eli died, storms brought back more than just sound. They brought the memory of his voice, angry and slurred, the crash of breaking dishes, the feel of rain on her face as she stood over the cliff edge, searching the darkness for any sign of movement below. "Mrs. Mayfield," Jack's voice drew her back. "Would you like me to go?" She realized she'd been sitting frozen, lost in memory. "No, I mean finish your coffee. The storm's getting worse." He studied her with those steady gray eyes. "My mother was afraid of storms too. After my father died, said they reminded her of things she'd rather forget." "I'm not afraid," Ruby said quickly. "No," he agreed. "Fear's too small a word for it." That startled her into meeting his gaze. There was no pity there, no judgment, just recognition. One survivor acknowledging another. They sat in silence while the storm raged outside. Not the uncomfortable silence of strangers, but something else. A mutual understanding that some things couldn't be spoken, only shared in the spaces between words. "I should check on Belle," he said finally. When the coffee was gone, Ruby walked him to the door, watching as he pulled on his boots. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the yard in stark relief. "Thank you for the wood," she said. He paused in the doorway. "There's more than one kind of storm. Mrs. Mayfield, some blow through in a few days. Others," he settled his hat carefully, "others we carry with us." After he left, Ruby stood at the door a long time, watching his figure disappear into the barn. Then she returned to her sewing, picking up the ruined fabric instead of discarding it. She found herself cutting it differently, working with the tear instead of against it. Sometimes damage couldn't be hidden, only transformed into something new. The thunder rolled on, but it seemed more distant now. She thought about his mother, sewing in Texas heat to keep her son fed, about storms that lasted longer than weather, about the careful distance between his hand and hers on the table, and how that small space had somehow felt like understanding. When night fell, she prepared 2 plates without hesitation. This time, when she went to leave his on the porch, she found him sitting on the top step, whittling another piece of wood. "Thought I'd save you the walk," he said, "if you don't mind the company." She should have minded, should have retreated behind her walls and veils. Instead, she handed him his plate and sat down beside him, careful to leave proper distance between them. They ate in companionable silence. Watching the storm move across the prairie, the thunder was moving east, leaving behind steady rain that would water the grass and fill the streams. "What are you carving?" she asked eventually. He held up the piece still rough, but taking shape. "A bird. Don't know what kind yet. Sometimes the wood decides." "Eli used to whittle," she said, surprising herself. "But he only ever made weapons, tiny knives and guns. Said it helped him think." "And what helps you think?" Ruby considered. "Thread and needle. The rhythm of it, making something useful from pieces." Sounds like mending more than just clothes. She turned to look at him then, this strange man who'd blown in with the storm. "Are you always this forward with your observations, Mr. Coulter?" "Only when I recognize a fellow mender." The rain continued its gentle patter on the porch roof. Somewhere in the darkness, a nightbird called despite the weather. Ruby realized she'd been outside without her veil, had forgotten it entirely. The thought should have panicked her. Instead, she felt oddly free. "I should go in," she said, not moving. "Probably should." Neither of them stood. The storm was passing, but something else was building, fragile as new thread, strong as prairie grass. Ruby didn't have a name for it yet. Didn't want one. For now, it was enough to sit in the rain-washed darkness, sharing silence with someone who understood that some wounds showed only in the way you flinched at thunder, of scars and silences. The morning after the storm broke clear and bright, prairie grass sparkling with moisture like scattered diamonds. Ruby found Jack already at work, repairing the chicken coop roof that had partially collapsed in the wind. She brought him coffee without being asked, a new rhythm establishing itself between them. "Belle's doing better," he said, accepting the cup. "Another day or 2 and she'll be sound enough to travel." Ruby nodded, ignoring the strange tightness in her chest. Of course he would leave. That had always been the arrangement. "I've been meaning to ask," she said instead. "That scar on your hand, the one across your knuckles, doesn't look like rope burn." He glanced down at his right hand, flexing it slightly. "Observant. Comes from measuring fabric. You notice details." "Apache arrow," he said simply. "Went clean through. Lucky it missed the tendons." "And the one on your neck?" His hand went unconsciously to his collar. "You are observant." "Sorry, I shouldn't pry." "No," he said slowly. "Fair's fair. I've been watching you too, Mrs. Mayfield. The way you hold yourself careful like when you reach for high shelves. The way you sometimes pause mid-stitch, like you're remembering something you'd rather forget." Ruby set down her coffee cup harder than necessary. "That's different." "Is it?" They stood facing each other in the morning sun. 2 people marked by violence they hadn't chosen. Ruby felt exposed without her veil, but she'd stopped wearing it around the property. Somehow, with him, it seemed pointless to hide. "The neck scar," Jack said finally, "came from a cavalry saber. Not Apache, one of our own, drunk and mean after a failed raid. Decided I looked too much like the enemy with my dark hair and sun-browned skin." "What happened to him?" "Nothing official, but soldiers have their own justice. He fell off his horse one night, broke his neck." Jack's expression was unreadable. Funny how accidents happen in the dark. Ruby understood the weight of those words, the careful way he spoke them, testing her reaction. She thought of Eli at the bottom of a Devil's Ridge, rain washing away footprints and evidence alike. "Yes," she said quietly. "Accidents do happen." They worked in silence after that. Jack on the roof and Ruby tending her garden. The storm had battered her tomato plants, but most would survive. She found herself stealing glances at him as she worked, noting the careful way he moved around his old injury, the competent hands that could split wood or carve delicate birds with equal skill. Near noon, the sound of horses made them both look up. 3 riders were approaching from town, Sheriff Clayton and 2 deputies. Ruby's blood went cold. Mrs. Mayfield." The sheriff touched his hat brim. His eyes took in Jack's presence with sharp interest. "Heard you had a visitor. Thought we'd check in, make sure everything's proper." "How thoughtful," Ruby said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Mr. Coulter's horse went lame in the storm. He's been kind enough to help with repairs while he waits for her to heal." "That's so." Clayton dismounted, his deputies following suit. "Don't believe we've met. Mr. Coulter, you passing through?" "Heading north for seasonal work," Jack said easily. "Climbing down from the roof. Should be on my way tomorrow, weather permitting." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Lot of strangers been through lately? Had some trouble over in Bridger stage robbery. 2 men killed. You wouldn't know anything about that." "News to me," Jack replied. "I've been traveling alone. Prefer it that way." Clayton circled him slowly, like a wolf sizing up prey. "That's a government-issue saddle in the barn. You cavalry?" "Was mustered out 2 years back." "Papers." Jack pulled a worn envelope from his shirt pocket, handing it over without hesitation. Clayton made a show of examining the discharge papers, though Ruby suspected he could barely read them. "Apache fighter," the sheriff said finally. "Explains the scars. Also explains why you're comfortable with violence. Most men who've seen war are comfortable with violence." "Sheriff," Jack said calmly, "difference is, some of us learned when not to use it." The tension stretched taut between them. Ruby stepped forward. "Was there something specific you needed, Sheriff, or are you just harassing travelers on my property now?" Clayton's face darkened. "Just being neighborly, Mrs. Mayfield. Town worries about you out here alone, especially given the circumstances of your widowhood." The words hung in the air like a threat. Ruby felt Jack shift slightly, moving closer to her without seeming to. "I appreciate the concern," she said coldly. "But as you can see, I'm managing fine." "For now," Clayton said. He handed Jack's papers back. "We'll be keeping an eye out. Mr. Coulter, this is a law-abiding town. We don't take kindly to drifters who overstay their welcome." After they left, Ruby sank onto the porch steps, shaking. Jack sat beside her, careful not to touch. "They suspect about your husband." He said it wasn't a question. "Sheriff Clayton courted me before I married Eli," Ruby said, the words tumbling out. "He took it personal when I chose someone else. Been looking for a way to prove I'm not the grieving widow I pretend to be." "Were there marks?" Jack asked quietly. "When they found him." Ruby laughed bitterly. "The fall took care of that. Rocks and river did what they do to a body. By the time they pulled him out, wasn't much to examine." "But you carry the marks." She looked at him sharply. "What makes you say that?" Instead of answering directly, Jack rolled up his left sleeve. A pattern of scars ran from wrist to elbow, some old, some newer. "Comanche raid when I was 15. They kept me 3 days before the Rangers found me. These are the marks that show." He touched his temple. "The others are in here. Those are the ones that wake me at night." Ruby found herself reaching out, her fingers barely grazing one of the scars. "Does it get easier, the carrying?" "No," he said honestly. "But you get stronger. And sometimes, if you're lucky, You find someone else who understands the weight." She pulled her hand back, but he caught it gently, turned it over to reveal the faint scars on her palm defensive wounds from catching Eli's belt that last night. "He hurt you," Jack said. "He was drunk, angry about money, about the claims not paying out, said it was my fault, that I'd trapped him in this God-forsaken place." The words poured out like water through a broken dam. "He came at me with his fists first, then his belt. I grabbed it, tried to stop him. He laughed, said no one would believe me, that a husband had rights." "What happened then?" "I pushed him." She met Jack's eyes. "Hard as I could. The door was open from where he'd come in. He went backward, lost his balance. The ridge was right there, 20 feet down to rocks and water." "You defended yourself." "I killed my husband." "No," Jack said firmly. "You survived him. There's a difference." They sat in silence, her hand still in his. The sun climbed higher, warming their faces. Ruby thought about the weight she'd carried alone for 8 months, how speaking it aloud should have made her feel worse. Instead, she felt lighter, as if sharing the burden had somehow halved it. "What will you do about the sheriff?" Jack asked eventually. "What I've been doing, maintain the fiction, play the grieving widow." She laughed shakily. "Though I seem to be failing at that lately." "Because you stopped wearing the veil. Because I'm sitting here holding hands with a stranger." Jack squeezed gently before letting go. "We're not strangers anymore. Ruby, we're two people who've seen the worst the world can do and chosen to keep going anyway." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his Texas drawl did something to her insides she wasn't ready to examine. "You should leave tomorrow," she said. "The sheriff won't give up. He'll make trouble for you if you stay." "Probably should," Jack agreed. "Question is, what happens after I go? You can't fight him alone forever." "I've been doing fine." "You've been surviving, not the same as living." Ruby stood abruptly. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "Don't I?" He remained seated, looking up at her with those steady gray eyes. "I know you jump at thunder but face down sheriffs without flinching. I know you create beautiful things with your hands while carrying ugly memories in your heart. I know you gave shelter to a stranger, even though trust comes hard." "Stop." "I know what it's like to wake up screaming, to flinch when someone moves too fast, to wonder if you're broken beyond fixing." I said stop, but there was no force behind it. Jack stood slowly. "I'll leave tomorrow if that's what you want, but Ruby, you're not broken. Bent, maybe scarred, definitely, but not broken. Broken things don't create beauty. They don't show kindness to lame horses and wounded men." He walked back to the barn, leaving her standing in the sunshine with tears on her cheeks. The first tears she'd cried since that night on the ridge. They felt like spring rain after drought necessary and cleansing. That evening, she didn't leave his supper on the porch. Instead, she called him to her table. They ate together properly, talking of small things, the garden, the horses, plans for fixing the well pump. Neither mentioned the sheriff's visit or tomorrow's departure. When darkness fell, Jack rose to leave. At the door, he paused. "That scar on your neck," Ruby said suddenly. "You never finished the story." He touched it again, a reflexive gesture. "The soldier who attacked me, he had friends. They came for me one night, drunk and looking for revenge. Would have killed me, but my sergeant intervened. Took a saber meant for me." His voice dropped. "He died protecting someone he'd only known 3 months. Never understood why until today." "Why today?" Jack looked at her for a long moment. "Because today I realized I'd take a saber for you too, Ruby Mayfield, and that terrifies me more than any Apache war party ever did." He left before she could respond, disappearing into the darkness. Ruby stood at her door, hand pressed to her throat, feeling the pulse of life beneath scarred skin. Tomorrow he would leave. It was the wise choice, the safe choice. But tonight, she allowed herself to imagine a different choice. One where scars were maps of survival rather than shame. Where two damaged people might build something whole from their broken pieces. The night wind carried the scent of rain-washed earth and new growth. Ruby went inside and picked up her sewing, but instead of mending, she began something new, a shirt, sized for a tall man with broad shoulders and careful hands. She might never give it to him, but creating it felt like hope, and hope, she was learning, could be its own form of courage. A Sunday ride. Ruby woke to the sound of church bells carrying faintly from town. Sunday. Jack would leave today. Bell's hoof had healed enough for travel. She'd watched him test the mare's gait yesterday evening, seen the satisfied nod that meant his horse was road-ready. She dressed carefully, choosing her second-best dress, a deep green that Eli had always hated, said it made her look like a schoolmarm. Her fingers hesitated at the veil hanging on its hook, then passed it by. If this was to be their last day, she wouldn't spend it hiding. Jack was in the barn when she found him, his few possessions already packed in saddlebags. He looked up at her approach, and something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, or appreciation. "Morning," he said simply. "It's Sunday. I noticed." She took a breath. "I don't go to church, haven't since Eli died, but I usually ride out to the hills, gather herbs for my dyes, prairie roses and wild indigo. They're blooming now after the rain." He continued checking his saddle, movements careful and precise. "Sounds peaceful." "It is." Another breath. "Would you, that is, if you're not in a hurry to leave." "Ruby." He turned to face her fully. "Are you asking me to ride with you?" The directness of it made her cheeks warm. "Your mare could use an easy ride before a long journey. Test that hoof properly." A slow smile spread across his face, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, made him look younger despite the scars. "Well, when you put it that way, it'd be foolish to refuse." They saddled the horses in companionable silence. Ruby on Samson, steady and familiar. Jack on Belle, who seemed eager to stretch her legs. The morning was perfect clear sky. Gentle breeze, the prairie washed clean and sparkling. They rode east, away from town, toward the low hills that marked the edge of settled land. Ruby led the way along paths she'd traveled alone for months, but having Jack beside her felt natural, like recovering something she hadn't known was missing. "You ride well," he observed, watching her navigate a narrow creek crossing. "Eli insisted I learn, said a frontier wife who couldn't ride was useless." She shook her head. "One of the few useful things he taught me, though he didn't mean to." "How's that?" "He meant for me to be able to fetch supplies, run his errands. Instead, riding became my freedom. These Sunday rides were the only time I could breathe." They climbed gradually into the hills, the horses picking their way through sage and buffalo grass. Jack pointed out track steer, rabbit, the deeper prints of an elk. He had a tracker's eye, reading the land like scripture. "There," Ruby pointed to a sheltered valley ahead. "That's where the best roses grow." The valley was a hidden paradise, protected from wind and rich with runoff from the hills. Wild roses climbed over rocks in pink profusion, their scent heavy in the warm air. Purple indigo swayed among the grasses, and Ruby spotted the yellow blooms of wild chamomile. They dismounted, letting the horses graze while they gathered herbs. Ruby showed Jack which plants made the best dyes, how to harvest without killing the root. He listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he understood the skill involved. "My mother would have loved this," he said, carefully cutting rose stems. "She was always trying to grow flowers in Texas. Too hot, too dry. But she kept trying." "Tell me about her." He straightened, looking out over the valley. "Margaret Ann Coulter. Tiny woman, barely 5 feet, but fierce as any man I've known. After Pa died, everyone said she should remarry quick or send me to relatives. Instead, She opened a seamstress shop, worked 18-hour days to keep us fed and respectable. What happened to her? Cholera outbreak, summer of '71. I was with the Rangers by then. Couldn't get back in time. His voice roughened. She died alone. Ruby. After everything she survived, she died alone in that little shop. Ruby moved closer, not quite touching, but offering presence. She wasn't alone. She had all the lives she'd touched, all the people she'd helped. That matters. Does it? It has to. She thought of her own future, the long years stretching ahead. Otherwise, what's the point of enduring? They worked in silence after that, filling Ruby's gathering basket with herbs and flowers. The sun climbed higher, warming their shoulders. When the basket was full, they found shade beneath a lone cottonwood and shared the simple lunch. Ruby had packed cold chicken, bread, early apples from her tree. I haven't done this in years, Jack said, leaning back against the tree trunk. Just sat, enjoyed a day. When did you start running? He considered. After mustering out, I tried to settle. Took a job on a ranch near Austin. Good outfit, fair boss, but the nights were too quiet. Too much time to think. One morning I just saddled Belle and rode out. Been moving ever since. And it helps the moving. Sometimes. Other times it's just geography. Can't outride what's in your head. Ruby pulled off her sunbonnet, letting the breeze cool her neck. I used to think if I could just get away from here, start fresh somewhere. But then I realized I'd still be me. Still be the woman who pushed her husband off a cliff. The woman who survived. Jack corrected firmly. There's no shame in that. No. Then why do I wake up guilty? Why do I see his face every time I look in the mirror? Jack shifted to face her. Because you're human. Because even when we do what we must, it leaves marks. But guilt isn't the same as wrong. Ruby, sometimes it's just the price of staying alive. She studied his face, this man who'd appeared with the storm and upended her careful isolation. Is that why you're really leaving? Because you recognize another killer? I'm leaving because staying would complicate your life. The sheriff's already suspicious. A drifter hanging around the widow Mayfield that's fuel for gossip that could burn you. And if I said I don't care about gossip, then I'd say you're not thinking clearly. Ruby laughed, surprising herself. Jack Coulter, I haven't thought clearly since you made camp on my land. You've disrupted everything. I apologize for that. Don't. She reached out, touched the back of his hand where it rested on his knee. These past days, I'd forgotten what it felt like to talk to someone who sees past the surface, to not be alone with the weight. He turned his hand over, interlacing their fingers. Ruby? I know you have to go. I'm not asking you to stay. But can we have today, just today, without talking about tomorrow? His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. Yeah, we can have today. They stayed in the valley through the afternoon, talking about everything and nothing. Jack told her about places he'd seen: the endless grass of Kansas, the mountains of Colorado, desert sunsets that painted the world in fire. Ruby shared memories from before Eli, when she'd been young and full of plans that didn't include marriage to a man who'd turned cruel. As the sun began its descent, they rode back slowly, neither wanting to break the spell. Ruby without her veil, laughing at something Jack said about a ornery mule he'd once owned. Jack relaxed in his saddle. The constant watchfulness eased for once. They looked like any couple returning from a Sunday ride, ordinary, unremarkable, whole. It was only when they crested the last hill and saw the homestead below that reality intruded. Jack pulled up, his expression closing off. Ruby, there's something I need to tell you about why I really can't stay. She felt her heart sink but kept her voice steady. You're wanted somewhere. No, worse. He stared at the horizon. That soldier I told you about, the one who died protecting me. He had a daughter, Sarah, after I mustered out. I went to find her, to tell her how brave her father was. She was so young. Ruby, 18 to my 30. I should have been wiser. You loved her. I thought I did. We married quick, too quick. But she wasn't seeing me. She was seeing a link to her dead father. And I was trying to fill a hole that couldn't be filled. We made each other miserable. The fighting got bad. And one night, he stopped, jaw working. You don't have to. One night she came at me with a kitchen knife, said if I was so eager to die like her father, she'd help me along. I got it away from her, but she fell, hit her head on the stove, blood everywhere. She lived, but barely. Her family ran me out of town, said if I ever showed my face again, they'd kill me, legal or not. Ruby absorbed this, another layer of scar tissue they shared. Is she still alive? Far as I know, her aunt wrote once, said Sarah had recovered but wasn't right anymore. Sees things that aren't there. They blame me. He finally looked at Ruby. Maybe they're right. Or maybe two broken people tried to heal each other and made it worse. Ruby said softly. It happens. Jack, it's not evil, just sad. Either way, I'm poison to women who deserve better. That's why I can't stay. Ruby, not because of gossip or sheriffs, because I won't risk breaking another good woman. Ruby nudged Samson closer until her knee touched Jack's. Look at me. When he did, she held his gaze steady. I'm not some innocent girl looking for a substitute father. I am a woman who survived her own darkness. If I break, it won't be because of you. Ruby, take me home, Jack, and tonight, after supper. Tell me you're leaving because it's what you need to do for yourself, not because you think I need protecting from you. They rode back as shadows lengthened across the prairie. In the barn, they unsaddled the horses in silence, hands brushing as they worked. Ruby felt the weight of endings pressing down, but also something else, a fierce determination not to let fear decide for either of them. At her door, she turned back. Supper's at 6. I'm making pot roast. If you're not there, I'll understand. But Jack, I'm done hiding behind veils, literal or otherwise. Maybe it's time you were too. She went inside without waiting for an answer, her hands full of prairie roses and wild herbs, her heart full of possibilities she hadn't dared imagine until a stranger rode in with the storm. The letter and the lawman. The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried by young Tommy Morrison, who worked odd jobs around town. Ruby saw him coming up the path and knew immediately something was wrong. Tommy never rode out this far unless paid extra for urgency. Mrs. Mayfield, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Sheriff said to give you this personal-like. Ruby took the envelope, her name written in Clayton's heavy hand. Thank you, Tommy. The boy lingered, clearly curious, but Ruby waited until he'd ridden off before breaking the seal. Jack emerged from the barn where he'd been mending harnesses still here. Despite their conversation Sunday night, neither had spoken of leaving since. Trouble, he asked, seeing her face. She handed him the letter, wordlessly. His expression darkened as he read, Mrs. Mayfield. The letter began. This serves as formal notice that Judge Samuel Brennan of the Territorial Court will be arriving Friday to review certain matters regarding the death of your husband, Eli Mayfield. New information has come to light which requires official examination. You are expected to make yourself available for questioning. Your cooperation is assumed. Sheriff William Clayton. New information? Ruby said bitterly. Clayton's been digging since you arrived. This is his way of forcing things. Jack folded the letter carefully. Judge Brennan, I've heard that name. He's known for being thorough but fair. Fair won't matter if Clayton's poisoned him with suspicion first. Ruby sank onto the porch step. He'll have witnesses. People who heard Eli and me arguing. Maybe someone who saw bruises I didn't hide well enough. When did Eli die? What date exactly? March 20th, first day of spring. She laughed without humor. I remember thinking how wrong it was. Him dying when everything else was coming alive. Jack sat beside her, calculating. That's over 8 months ago. Hard to prove much after that long. Clayton doesn't need proof. Just doubt. In a town this small, doubt is enough to ruin someone. She twisted her apron in her hands. Maybe I should run. Pack what I can. Head north. No. Jack's voice was firm. Running now makes you look guilty. Besides, where would you go? A woman alone with no references, no connections. I could go with you. The words hung between them, surprising them both. Jack turned to look at her fully. Ruby. I know what I said, but that was before this. She gestured at the letter. You're leaving anyway. Would it be so terrible to have company? You don't know what you're asking. Don't I? You think I haven't dreamed of it these past nights, loading Samson with what matters, riding out before dawn, becoming someone new in a place where no one knows my name. Jack stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch. And when we get wherever we're going, what then? You think we just play house like nothing happened? Think the past doesn't follow? I think the past follows either way, Ruby said quietly. At least with you, I wouldn't be facing it alone. He turned back to her, and she saw something raw in his expression. You don't understand. Sarah, what happened with her, it broke something in me. Ruby, I wake up nights thinking I see her blood on my hands, hear her screaming. What kind of man brings that to a woman's door? The kind who's been 3 days mending everything broken on my property. The kind who carves beautiful things from scraps. The kind who sees my scars and doesn't flinch. Your scars didn't come from me. No, Ruby agreed, standing to face him. They came from a man everyone thought was respectable, a man the whole town approved of. Maybe I trust your darkness more than their daylight. Before Jack could respond, the sound of horses interrupted. 3 riders approaching fast, Sheriff Clayton and 2 men Ruby didn't recognize. Her blood went cold. Inside, Jack said quietly. Let me handle this. But Ruby stood her ground. This is my land, my fight. Clayton dismounted with theatrical authority, his companions following suit. One was thin and nervous-looking, the other broad and brutal around the edges. Mrs. Mayfield, Coulter. The sheriff's smile was all teeth. These gentlemen are from Cheyenne. Mr. Hartwell here is Judge Brennan's advance man, and Mr. Doyle represents certain interested parties. What interested parties? Jack asked, though Ruby noticed his hand had shifted closer to his sidearm. Why, the deceased's business partners. Clayton said smoothly. Seems Eli Mayfield had debts, significant ones. Oil shale speculation gone wrong. These gentlemen have legal claim to any assets. There are no assets. Ruby said, Eli died broke. Everyone knows that. Ah, but there's the land. Doyle spoke for the first time, voice like gravel. Prime acreage, worth something to the right buyer. Ruby felt the trap closing. This land is mine, bought with my inheritance before I married. Prove it, Clayton said. Marriage makes a man and wife one under law. His debts become yours. And if the widow was responsible for making him unable to pay those debts, Hartwell let the implication hang. That's enough. Jack stepped forward. You're harassing this woman without cause. Either charge her formally or get off her property. Clayton's eyes glittered. Protective, aren't we? Tell me, Coulter, how long have you really been in town? Funny how you showed up right when Mrs. Mayfield might need an alibi established. You're suggesting I've been here since March? Jack kept his voice level. Check with the livery in Laramie. I was breaking horses there all spring. Were you? We'll have to verify that. Clayton produced another paper. In the meantime, Judge Brennan wants to ensure Mrs. Mayfield doesn't suddenly disappear. This is a formal order restricting her to the county until the hearing. Ruby took the paper with numb fingers. The walls were closing in. Clayton orchestrating everything perfectly. Furthermore, The sheriff continued. It would be appropriate for Mr. Coulter to find lodgings in town, to avoid any appearance of impropriety that might influence the judge. I'm staying, Jack said flatly. Then you'll be arrested for interfering with an investigation. Clayton rested his hand on his pistol. Your choice. The moment stretched taut. Ruby saw Jack calculating odds, measuring distances. She touched his arm lightly. Go, she said. Please, don't give them excuse to hurt you. Ruby, I'll be fine. It's 3 days until Friday. I've survived worse. Jack looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him memorize her face like he might not see it again. Then he nodded once. Sharp. I'll get my things. They watched him head to the barn. Doyle spat tobacco juice near Ruby's roses. Smart woman, though if you were really smart, you'd take my offer now. Sell the land. Use the money to start fresh somewhere, before things get complicated. Is that a threat? It's arithmetic, Doyle said. Add up what you've got to lose against what you might gain by being stubborn. Numbers don't lie. Jack emerged with his saddlebags and bell. He mounted without looking at the men, but his eyes found Ruby's. I'll be at Morrison's boarding house, he said, if you need anything. She won't, Clayton interjected. Will you, Mrs. Mayfield? Ruby lifted her chin. I've been managing alone for months. Sheriff, 3 more days won't matter. But as she watched Jack ride away, she felt the weight of isolation settle back on her shoulders like a familiar shroud. The men lingered another few minutes, Doyle making pointed observations about the property's value, Hartwell taking notes in a small book. After they finally left, Ruby went inside and barred the door. Her hands shook as she made coffee, the silence of the house pressing against her ears. She'd grown accustomed to Jack's presence, the sound of him working, the knowledge that she wasn't facing the world entirely alone. 3 days. She could survive 3 days. That night, she sat at her table with paper and pen, trying to write down everything she could remember about buying the land, about Eli's debts, about that night in March. But the words kept blurring, her mind circling back to Jack's offer to stay, to fight. She'd sent him away to protect him, but part of her wondered if she'd also been protecting herself from hoping too much, from believing that someone might actually stand with her when the world came calling for its pound of flesh. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance. Ruby touched the small wooden horse Jack had carved, now sitting on her mantel. Such a tiny thing, but proof that gentle hands could create beauty even after violence. 3 days, she whispered to the empty room. Then we'll see if justice is anything more than a word men use to dress up their wants. But even as she tried to steel herself for what was coming, she couldn't shake the feeling that Clayton had more planned than just a hearing. The judge was almost incidental, a formal stamp on whatever the sheriff had already decided. And somewhere in town, Jack Coulter was probably thinking the same thing, probably fighting the urge to saddle Belle and ride back despite the threats. Ruby blew out the lamp and checked the rifle one more time before bed. Whatever came with Friday's dawn, she'd face it standing. She'd survived Eli Mayfield's fists. She could survive William Clayton's version of justice. But for the first time since that night in March, she wasn't sure surviving would be enough. Fire at dusk. Thursday evening came with an oppressive heat that pressed down on Sagebrush Gulch like a flat iron. Ruby had spent the day trying to organize papers that might prove her ownership of the land. But most of the documents were in Eli's name or lost to his careless handling. Tomorrow's hearing loomed like a gathering storm. She was in the kitchen, attempting to eat a supper she had no appetite for, when she smelled smoke, not wood smoke from a stove or campfire, something sharper, chemical, oil smoke. Ruby ran to the window. Orange light flickered from behind the house where her storage shed stood, the shed where she kept her fabric stock, her dyes, the few precious things she'd hidden from Eli's rages. No! The word tore from her throat as she ran outside. The shed was fully engulfed, flames reaching hungry fingers toward the main house, Her rain barrel was nearly empty from the recent dry spell. Ruby grabbed buckets, running to the well, knowing it was already too late for the shed but desperate to save her home. Fire at the Mayfield place. The shout came from the road. Jonas Henley, her nearest neighbor, racing his wagon toward town. Help would come, but would it be in time? Ruby worked frantically, throwing bucket after bucket, her dress soaked and clinging, smoke burning her lungs. The heat was incredible, pushing her back even as she fought forward. Then suddenly Jack was there, materializing from the darkness like he'd been conjured. He grabbed a bucket from her hands. "The house!" he shouted over the roar. "Form a line to save the house." More people arrived, neighbors she barely knew, townspeople who'd kept their distance for months. They formed a bucket brigade from the well, Jack directing the effort with military efficiency. Ruby found herself between Mrs. Patterson and old Samuel Chen, passing buckets until her arms screamed. The fire fought them, jumping to the chicken coop, sending terrified birds scattering into the night. But the human chain held, protecting the main house even as the outbuildings burned. "Let it go," someone finally called as the shed collapsed in a shower of sparks. "It's done. Save your strength for the house." They kept the line going until the danger passed, until only smoldering ruins remained where Ruby's workshop had been. People stood panting, faces blackened with soot, clothes ruined. That's when Martha Brennan pushed through the crowd. The judge's wife, a small woman with silver hair and fierce eyes. "This weren't no accident," she declared loudly. "I saw Doyle and 2 other men riding hard away from here not an hour ago. Saw them with my own eyes." Sheriff Clayton appeared as if summoned. "Now, Mrs. Brennan, that's a serious accusation. You certain about what you saw?" "William Clayton, I've known you since you were in short pants. Don't you dare question my eyesight." Martha's voice rose. "And while we're speaking truths, there's something else needs saying." "Martha," her husband warned, but she shook him off. "No, Samuel, I held my tongue too long already." She turned to face the crowd. "Eli Mayfield was a brute. We all knew it. Saw Ruby at market trying to hide bruises. Heard him raging when he'd been drinking." "Mrs. Brennan," Clayton started, but she wasn't done. "I saw him strike her once, right on Main Street. Backhanded her for dropping a package. And what did we do? Nothing. Too polite to interfere between man and wife." Her voice cracked. "We failed her, all of us, and now you want to punish her for surviving." The silence was deafening. Ruby stood frozen, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. Other voices began to speak up. "Saw him drag her out of church once," Jonas Henley said quietly. "Middle of service. She was crying. He broke her wrist 2 winters ago. Doctor," Morrison added, "claimed she fell, but I've set enough bones to know a twist injury when I see one." "Used to hear them fighting." Agnes Chen whispered, "Heard things breaking. Heard her begging." One by one, the testimonies came. All the things people had seen and ignored. The open secret of Eli Mayfield's cruelty laid bare in the flickering light of Ruby's burning past. Clayton's face had gone dark with rage. "None of this changes the law." "The hell it doesn't." Jack stepped forward, and Ruby saw several men move with him, veterans. She realized, recognizing the way they held themselves. "You want to talk a law? Sheriff, let's talk about a woman's right to defend herself. Let's talk about justice that protects the guilty and punishes the innocent." "You threatening me?" "Coulter, I'm stating facts. Mrs. Mayfield defended herself against a man who would have killed her eventually. Everyone here knows it. The only crime is that it took her so long." Judge Brennan cleared his throat. "Sheriff, I think we need to discuss postponing tomorrow's hearing until this fire can be investigated properly." "Now wait a minute." "No, you wait." The judge's mild manner had steel underneath. "Someone burned this woman's property the night before she was to appear in my court. That changes things considerably." Clayton looked around at the crowd. seeing the shift in mood. These people might have been silent before, but fire had a way of burning away pretense, and Martha Brennan's courage had opened a floodgate. "Fine," he spat. "But she stays in town tonight, for her own protection." "She'll stay with us," Martha announced. "And Mr. Coulter will escort her, unless you have objections to a woman showing Christian charity." Sheriff, trapped by his own words about protection, Clayton could only nod curtly before stalking off. The crowd began to disperse, several people stopping to press Ruby's hand or murmur apologies for their past silence. When they were mostly alone, Ruby found herself in Jack's arms without quite knowing how she got there. She pressed her face against his smoke-stained shirt and let herself shake. "It's gone," she whispered. "Everything I was building, my work, my independence." "Not everything." He stroked her soot-tangled hair. "You're alive? The house stands, and you're not alone anymore." She pulled back to look at him. "How did you know to come?" "Saw the smoke from town. Nothing could have kept me away." His jaw tightened. This was a message. Ruby, Clayton, or Doyle. Maybe both. They want you broken before tomorrow. "Are you broken?" Martha Brennan approached, practical as always. "No, then you're not beaten. Come, both of you. Hot baths and strong coffee at my house. We'll sort the rest in the morning." As they prepared to leave, Ruby looked back at the smoldering ruins. All her fabric, her carefully mixed dyes, the small treasures she'd saved gone. But as neighbors continued to wet down the ashes, preventing any spread, she realized something had risen from the fire too. Truth, spoken aloud at last, witnessed by the community that had failed her once but stood with her now. "Wait," she said suddenly. She walked to the ruins, Jack shadowing her protectively. There, in what had been the corner where she kept her most precious things, something glinted in the ashes. Her mother's thimble, silver, tarnished now but intact. She'd hidden it there years ago, afraid Eli would pawn it. Ruby picked it up, still warm from the fire. "Mama always said silver could survive anything," she murmured. "That's why they make thimbles from it, to protect what's soft and easily torn." Jack closed his hand over hers, the thimble between their palms. "Then it's fitting you found it tonight. You've been protecting this whole town's conscience. Ruby, maybe it's time they protected you back." Judge Brennan approached as they reached the road. "Mrs. Mayfield, I want you to know tomorrow's hearing will be fair. You have my word, and after what I've heard tonight," he shook his head, "justice delayed is justice denied, but better late than never." Ruby nodded, not trusting her voice. As Martha Brennan's buggy carried them toward town, she kept her hand in Jack's, the silver thimble pressed between them like a promise. Behind them, the last of the fire died to embers. But something new had been forged in its heat, a community's determination to finally speak truth, and two hearts that refused to let fear win. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, Ruby Mayfield was no longer the widow on the edge, alone with her secrets. She was a survivor, witnessed and defended, holding tight to a silver thimble in the hand of a man who'd ridden through fire to stand beside her. The stars came out as they reached town, bright and clear above the smoke, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ruby looked up at them with something that felt dangerously like hope. A place to call home. The weeks following the hearing passed in a blur of rebuilding. Judge Brennan had dismissed all charges, citing lack of evidence and the clear testimony of community members about Eli's violent nature. Sheriff Clayton resigned in disgrace after Doyle was arrested for arson the man had broken under questioning, admitting Clayton had promised him Ruby's land in exchange for handling the widow problem. Now, on a crisp September morning, Ruby stood where her shed had been, watching Jack and several neighbors raise the frame of a new workshop. The townspeople had surprised her with lumber donations and labor, a community apology of sorts for their years of silence. "Looking good, Mrs. Mayfield," Jonas Henley called out, helping Jack secure a corner beam. Bigger than the old one, too. Mrs. Patterson insisted I'd need more room, Ruby said. Seems half the town wants new clothes now that they know my story. Strange how fire can change things. Jack climbed down from the frame, wiping sweat from his brow. He'd stayed. Of course, after the hearing, he'd simply returned to fixing things around her property as if the question of leaving had never existed. They hadn't spoken of it directly, this new arrangement. But his belongings had gradually migrated from the barn to the small room off her kitchen that had once been Eli's office. You need anything from town? He asked. Thought I'd ride in for more nails. We're low on coffee, Ruby said, then hesitated. Jack, people are talking. Let them talk. I mean about us, about you staying here without... She gestured vaguely. He stepped closer, voice dropping. Without what? Ruby, without a ring, without words said in front of a preacher. His hand found hers, rough and warm. I've had both those things. They didn't make a marriage. What we have, this partnership, this understanding, it's more real than any ceremony. I know, but... Mrs. Mayfield. A young voice interrupted. Tommy Morrison approached on foot, leading a familiar bay mare. Found this horse wandering near the creek. Thought she might be yours. Jack frowned. That's Belle, but I left her secure in the paddock. They walked to investigate and found the gate open, the latch clearly tampered with. Jack's expression darkened as he examined it. Someone let her out deliberately, he said, then, louder. Appreciate you bringing her back. Tommy, here. He pressed a coin into the boy's hand. After Tommy left, Ruby touched Jack's arm. Who would... Could be anyone still loyal to Clayton, or just someone who thinks I don't belong here. He led Belle back to the paddock, checking her over carefully. Might be time to make things clearer. Ruby, about where I stand, where we stand. That evening, as they sat down to supper, Jack seemed unusually thoughtful. He'd been quiet since the incident with Belle, working steadily but distantly. I've been thinking, he said finally, about roots, about running, about what makes a place home. Ruby set down her fork, sensing the weight of the moment. I've crisscrossed this country for 2 years, he continued, seen beautiful places, met good people, but I never stopped moving because nowhere felt like a reason to stay. He looked at her directly. Until here, until you. Jack! Let me finish. He pulled something from his pocket, a small leather pouch. I've been carrying this since Austin, my mother's wedding ring. Kept meaning to sell it. Never could. He placed it on the table between them. I'm not asking you to wear it, not asking for anything traditional, but I want you to know I'm done running. This is home now, if you'll have me. Ruby picked up the ring, a simple gold band worn thin with years. Your mother's... She wore it 40 years, through good times and bad, feast and famine. Never took it off, even when she could have pawned it to feed us easier. His voice roughened. I'd like to think she'd approve of you having it. I can't replace Sarah, Ruby said softly, any more than you can replace Eli, though God knows that's no loss. I'm not looking for replacement. Jack reached across the table, covering her hand with his. I'm looking for something new, something built on truth instead of fantasy or fear. Ruby turned the ring over, watching lamplight catch its surface. She thought of all the reasons to say no, the gossiping tongues, the impropriety, the scars they both carried. Then she thought of these past weeks, working side by side, sharing quiet evenings and morning coffee. How natural it felt. How right. I won't wear it on my left hand, she said finally. That finger had a ring that meant ownership. This one, she slipped it onto her right hand. This means partnership. Choice. Is that acceptable? Jack's smile was answer enough. He stood, pulling her up with him, and for the first time kissed her properly. Not the desperate kiss of people grasping at connection, but the steady warmth of two people choosing to build something together. When they broke apart, Ruby laughed shakily. "The town will be scandalized, the widow Mayfield taking up with a drifter." "Former drifter," Jack corrected. "Now I'm a settled man with a woman to come home to and a workshop to finish building. Speaking of which," he grew serious again, "I want to put my name on the deed with yours. Legal partnership, protection. If anything happens to me, no one can question your claim again." "Nothing's going to happen to you." "Ruby." He cupped her face gently. "We both know the world's uncertain. Let me do this right. Let me protect what matters." She leaned into his touch. "All right, but partnership means equal say. I won't be managed. Jack Coulter, not ever again." "Wouldn't dream of it. I've seen what you do to men who try." It wasn't a joke. Not really. But they both smiled. The ghost of Eli Mayfield had no power here. In this kitchen where two survivors chose to forge something new from their broken pieces. Over the next days, word spread as word always did in small towns. Some disapproved Ruby could see it in their pinched faces at the mercantile, but more approved, especially the women who'd spoken up the night of the fire. Martha Brennan was particularly vocal in her support. "About time you found happiness," she said, examining fabric samples in Ruby's temporary workspace. "And that Jack Coulter's good people. Anyone can see how he looks at you." "How's that?" Ruby asked, curious despite herself. "Like you're precious but not fragile. Like he sees your strength and admires it instead of fearing it." Martha selected a deep blue wool. "That's rare in a man. Dear, don't let small minds make you question it." The new workshop rose quickly with so many hands helping. Jack proved popular with the other men, his quiet competence and military bearing earning respect. Ruby often caught him teaching the younger boys knots or woodworking, patient with their clumsy fingers. One evening, she found him sitting with Agnes Chen's son, showing him how to oil leather properly. "You're good with children," she observed after the boy ran home for supper. Jack's hands stilled on the harness he was mending. "Always figured I'd have some before everything went wrong." He looked up at her. "Is that something you'd want children?" Ruby considered. With Eli, the thought had terrified her, bringing innocence into that violence. But now, "Maybe," she said carefully. "If they came, would you want that?" "With you, yes. Simple, direct, honest. But only if you're sure. We've got time to decide." Time. Such a luxury after months of survival measured in days. Ruby sat beside him, picking up her own mending. They worked in companionable silence as the sun set, the new workshop casting long shadows across the yard. "I love you," she said suddenly, surprising herself. She'd never said it to Eli. Not really, but this felt necessary, like marking a moment. "I want you to know that, in case I don't say it enough." Jack set aside the harness and took her hands. "I love you too. Ruby. Have for a while now. Probably since you brought me coffee in the rain and didn't ask questions I couldn't answer." "That was only," she counted back, amazed. "6 weeks ago feels like a lifetime." "Sometimes a lifetime happens in 6 weeks." He kissed her palm, right where the defensive scars had faded to thin white lines. "Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air for new growth." That night, for the first time, Ruby didn't bar her bedroom door. When nightmares came Eli's face, the cliff, the fall, Jack was there, solid and warm, murmuring comfort until the shadows retreated. And when his own demons surfaced, Sarah's blood, Apache screams. The faces of men he'd killed Ruby held him steady, anchoring him to the present with touch and whispered words. They were building more than a workshop. She realized they were building a life. Imperfect, unconventional, but theirs. A place where broken people could mend, where past sins could transform into future wisdom, where love grew not from innocence, but from understanding. As autumn settled over Wyoming, painting the prairie in gold and amber, Ruby Mayfield, survivor, Seamstress, and no longer widow, stood in her new workshop planning winter inventory. Jack had installed larger windows for better light, built sturdy shelves for her salvaged fabrics. The space smelled of fresh lumber and possibility. "Happy?" Jack asked from the doorway, watching her arrange supplies. "Getting there," Ruby said, turning to smile at him. "Ask me again in spring." "I'll ask you every season," he promised, "long as you'll let me." She crossed to him, stood on tiptoe to kiss him briefly. "Then you'll be asking for a very long time, Mr. Coulter." "I'm counting on it. Mrs. Mayfield." The title would stick. She'd been the widow Mayfield too long to become anything else to the town. But now it meant something different. Not a woman defined by loss, but one who'd chosen love after learning its true cost. Not a victim of the past, but an architect of the future. And in her workshop, on a shelf Jack had built specially, sat her mother's silver thimble, tarnished by fire but unbroken. A reminder that some things survived burning to become stronger than before. Winter's quiet. Snow fell softly outside the kitchen window, blanketing the prairie in pristine white. Ruby sat near the stove, her sewing forgotten in her lap as she watched Jack split firewood in the yard. Even after 4 months together, she sometimes marveled at his presence, the quiet certainty of him, the way he moved through her world as if he'd always belonged there. Her hand went unconsciously to her belly, still flat but holding a secret she'd confirmed just that morning with Dr. Morrison. The knowledge sat warm and terrifying inside her, a future taking root despite all the reasons it shouldn't. Jack came in, stamping snow from his boots, cheeks ruddy from the cold. "Got enough wood to last the week," he said, then paused, studying her face. "You all right? You look pale." "Sit down," Ruby said quietly. "There's something I need to tell you." His expression shifted immediately to concern, and he took the chair across from her, reaching for her hands. "What is it? Are you ill?" "No, not ill." She took a breath. "I'm with child. Jack, about 2 months along. Dr. Morrison thinks." The silence stretched between them, Jack's face cycling through emotions too quickly to read. Finally, he squeezed her hands gently. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "Happy, confused. I never thought after Eli. I assumed I couldn't. He always blamed me for that too." She met Jack's eyes. "How do you feel?" "Like the world just shifted," he said honestly. "Like everything I thought I knew about my future needs adjusting." He moved his chair closer, cupping her face. "But Ruby, if you're asking if I want this, yes, God, yes." "Even though we're not properly married, even though people will count months and whisper." "Let them count. Let them whisper." His thumb stroked her cheek. "We know what we are to each other. That's what matters." Ruby leaned into his touch, some of her fear easing. "I was afraid you'd want to leave, that this would be too much, too binding." "Ruby Mayfield, I already told you I'm done running. A child just means more reason to stay." He smiled then, wonder breaking through. "A baby. Our baby. Our baby," she repeated, the words feeling more real. "Born in summer, if I'm counting right." They sat together as snow continued to fall, hands linked, adjusting to this new reality. Finally, Jack spoke again. "I want to teach them things," he said softly. "How to read animal tracks, mend leather, carve wood, all the things my father never got to show me." "And I'll teach them to sew," Ruby added. "To create beauty from scraps, to be strong but gentle." She hesitated. "What if I'm not a good mother? What if I'm too broken, too—" "Stop!" Jack moved to kneel beside her chair. "You're the strongest woman I know. You survived hell and came out kind. That's what our child needs, not perfection, but persistence. Love despite the odds." "When did you become so wise?" Ruby asked, running her fingers through his hair. "Must be your influence." He rested his head against her knee. Though I'm scared too, if that helps. Never thought I'd get another chance at this. They spent the evening making quiet plans. The small room off the kitchen could become a nursery. Jack would build a cradle. He'd already started sketching designs in the margins of her account books. Ruby would sew tiny clothes, teach herself lullabies she barely remembered from her own childhood. As winter deepened, their secret became harder to hide. Ruby's waist thickened. Her face gained a glow that had the town women exchanging knowing looks. But no one spoke of it directly until Martha Brennan cornered her at the Mercantile. "When are you due, dear?" she asked bluntly. "July," Ruby admitted, bracing for judgment. Instead, Martha smiled. "Good. Summer babies are easier. I'll organize the women for a quilting bee. Every baby needs a proper welcome, regardless of circumstances." The support continued to surprise her. Women who'd kept their distance before now stopped to chat, sharing pregnancy wisdom and remedies for morning sickness. Even some who clearly disapproved of her unconventional arrangement couldn't resist offering advice about swollen ankles and food cravings. Jack, for his part, became almost comically protective. He insisted on accompanying her everywhere, shoveled every path twice, and watched her like she might shatter. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Ruby told him one evening after he'd tried to carry her sewing basket for her. "I know," he said, looking sheepish. "Just this matters so much. Ruby, you matter. Both of you. I can't help wanting to guard that." She softened, understanding. They'd both lost so much the urge to protect this new happiness was overwhelming. Winter nights were long and quiet, perfect for the conversations they'd never had time for during their chaotic beginning. Jack told her about his childhood in Texas, the father who'd died too young, the mother who'd held everything together through sheer will. Ruby shared memories of her parents, the small farm in Missouri she'd left to marry Eli, the dreams she'd had before learning that some men's love came with a price. "Do you ever wonder how different life might have been?" she asked one night as they lay together. His hand splayed protectively over her growing belly. "Sometimes," Jack admitted. "If Sarah had been older, more settled, if her father hadn't died, if I'd been wiser." He pressed a kiss to her shoulder. "But then I wouldn't be here. Wouldn't have you, or this little one. Maybe every wrong turn was just leading to the right destination." "That's a nice thought." "It's the only one that makes sense of the pain." As Ruby's pregnancy progressed, she found herself changing in unexpected ways. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long began to ease. She caught herself humming while she sewed, laughing more readily at Jack's dry observations. One afternoon, as she worked on tiny baby clothes, Jack came in from tending the horses. "You're not wearing black anymore," he observed. Ruby looked down at her dress, deep blue wool that brought out her eyes. "I hadn't realized. Just seemed time to let the morning clothes go." "It suits you. Color, I mean, everything's different now," she said, setting aside her sewing. "I used to wake up just trying to survive the day. Now I wake up thinking about the future, about names for the baby, about teaching them to ride, about—" She broke off, laughing. "Listen to me, planning years ahead like I have the right." "You have every right." Jack crossed to her, pulled her up into his arms. "We both do. That's what we're building here. Ruby. A future. A place where our child can grow up safe and loved." "What if I fail them? What if I turn out like—" "Like Eli," Jack finished gently. "You won't. Know how I know? Because you're worried about it. Because you're already thinking of them first. That's what good parents do." Ruby rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Outside, snow continued to fall, insulating their small world from the harsh realities beyond. But in here, by the warm stove with Jack's arms around her and new life growing within, she felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Peace. "I need to ask you something," she said, pulling back to look at him. "About names. If it's a boy, I'd like to call him Thomas." After your sergeant. The one who saved you. Jack's eyes went bright with unshed tears. He'd have liked that. Thomas William Coulter. He paused. If we're giving the baby my name. Of course we are. You're the father, aren't you? In every way that matters, he agreed. And if it's a girl? Ruby smiled. Margaret, after your mother. A strong name for what I hope will be a strong woman. Margaret Ann Mayfield Coulter. That's a mouthful. She'll grow into it. They stood together in the lamplit kitchen, snow falling soft outside, planning a future that once seemed impossible. Two broken people who'd found each other in a storm and chosen to build something whole from their shattered pieces. Later, as Ruby drifted toward sleep, she felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings, tentative but unmistakable. She grabbed Jack's hand, placed it where she'd felt the movement. Wait, she whispered. Then it came again, stronger. Jack's face transformed with wonder. That's our baby, he said, voice full of awe. That's our baby, Ruby confirmed. And in that moment, with winter wrapped around their home like a blanket and new life stirring between them, Ruby Mayfield finally understood what it meant to be truly, completely alive. Not just surviving, but living. Not just enduring, but hoping. The past would always be there, Eli's ghost, Sarah's shadow, the scars both visible and hidden. But the future was stronger. Love was stronger. And the tiny life beneath her heart was proof that even in the harshest ground, with careful tending, something beautiful could grow. 1,000 miles behind us. The July heat pressed down on Sagebrush Gulch like a physical weight. But inside the Mayfield house, a different kind of intensity held sway. Ruby gripped Jack's hand as another contraction rolled through her, Martha Brennan coaching her through the pain. That's it, dear. You're doing beautifully, Martha soothed. Won't be long now. Jack looked pale beneath his tan, but his grip never wavered. He'd faced Apache warriors and drunken soldiers, but this watching the woman he loved in pain he couldn't fix, this was a different kind of battle. Tell me again, Ruby gasped between contractions. About Texas, about the blue bonnets. Jack knew what she needed, distraction. His voice, something beyond the immediate struggle. Miles of them, he said, stroking her sweat-damp hair. Far as you can see, like the whole world turned blue and purple. My mother used to say they were pieces of sky that fell to earth and took root. Another contraction. Ruby bore down, Martha encouraging her, and then a cry, thin and fierce and perfect. It's a girl, Martha announced, cleaning the baby quickly before placing her on Ruby's chest. A beautiful, healthy girl. Ruby looked down at their daughter through tears, dark hair like Jack's, but her mouth, her stubborn chin. The baby's eyes opened briefly, that unfocused newborn blue that might become any color before closing again in exhaustion. Clara, Ruby whispered. We'll call her Clara. Jack touched the baby's tiny fist with one finger, his face soft with wonder. Not Margaret. Clara Margaret, Ruby amended. After your mother and mine, 2 strong women to watch over her. Later, after Martha had gone and the house had settled into quiet, Jack sat beside the bed watching Ruby nurse their daughter. The sight did something to his chest, made it tight and full at once. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. Been working on it all winter. Wanted to wait until she was here safe. Ruby looked up, curious, from his shirt pocket. Jack pulled a folded letter, worn from handling. I wrote to Benjamin Walsh, he continued. My old sergeant's brother. He's a lawyer in Austin. Asked him to look into things with Sarah's family. Ruby's breath caught. Jack! Just listen. He unfolded the letter. He wrote back last month. Says Sarah remarried 2 years ago. A shopkeeper from Houston. Good man by all accounts. She's better. Not perfect, but functioning. Has a son now. Oh, Jack, Ruby reached for his free hand. That must be a relief, he finished. Like a weight I didn't know I was still carrying. She found her way forward. Found someone who could give her what I couldn't. What else does the letter say? Jack scanned down. Her family's anger has cooled. They don't forgive me, but they don't seek vengeance either. Walsh says I'm free to live my life without looking over my shoulder. He refolded the letter carefully. I wanted Clara to come into a world where her father wasn't running from shadows, where we could build something solid. Ruby shifted Clara to her other side, studying Jack's face. Is that why you've been writing so many letters lately? Setting the past to rest? Some of it. Also been corresponding with horse breeders in Colorado. Thinking about starting a small operation here. Breeding quality saddle horses. This land's good for it, and there's demand. Jack Coulter, are you making long-term plans? He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his face. Man's got to provide for his family. Besides, I'm tired of fixing what's broken. Want to raise something from the start, train it right, horses, children, same principle. Did you just compare our daughter to a horse? You know what I mean. She did. The patience required. The gentle firmness. The understanding that trust was earned slowly and lost quickly. Jack would be a good father. She could see it in the careful way he held Clara, like she was spun glass and iron both. A knock at the door interrupted them. Jack went to answer. Returning with an unexpected visitor, Jonas Henley, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. Sorry to intrude, Jonas said. Wanted to bring this by. He held out an envelope. Folks in town took up a collection for the baby. Figured you might need things. Ruby opened it, eyes widening at the amount inside. Jonas, this is too much. It's not charity, he said quickly. Call it overdue payment. For all the times we should have helped and didn't. For looking away when we should have seen. He twisted his hat. My wife. She says women got to stick together. Says what happened with your first husband could have happened to any of us. If we're honest, we want to do better this time. After he left, Ruby counted the money again. Enough for a proper crib. Supplies for months. Maybe even some lumber for Jack's horse venture. See? Jack said, settling back beside her. Clara's already bringing out the best in people. The baby fussed, and Ruby adjusted her position, still marveling at the instincts that seemed to come with motherhood. I was so afraid, she admitted, that I wouldn't know how to do this, that Eli had broken something essential in me. You were already a mother, Jack said quietly. To this whole town's conscience, to every woman who saw you survive and found her own courage. Clara's just lucky enough to get you all to herself. As if in agreement, Clara made a small, contented sound, one tiny hand escaping her swaddling to grasp at air. Jack offered his finger, and she gripped it with surprising strength. Strong, he murmured, like her mother. Stubborn, Ruby corrected, like her father. They sat in comfortable silence, the afternoon heat making everything drowsy and slow. Through the window, Ruby could see her garden thriving, the new workshop busy with orders, the prairie grass golden in the sun. A year ago, she'd stood at this same window watching a stranger make camp on her land. Now that stranger held their daughter's hand, while Ruby's mother's ring caught the light on her finger, not a chain but a choice, not an ending but a beginning. I've been thinking, Jack said eventually, about what I want to tell Clara when she's older, about how we met, how we became a family. What will you say? He considered. That I rode 1,000 miles trying to escape love, only to find it waiting in a storm. That her mother was the bravest woman I ever met, brave enough to survive, brave enough to trust again, brave enough to build something new from ashes. And I'll tell her, Ruby added, that her father saw past veils and scars to the person underneath, that he stayed when staying was dangerous, that he chose us every day, even when choosing meant facing his own ghosts. Clara yawned, a tiny, perfect O of pink mouth. then settled into sleep. Ruby traced her daughter's features gently, memorizing each detail. "She'll never know him," she said suddenly. "Eli, she'll never have to fear footsteps in the dark or angry voices. She'll grow up with gentle hands and patient words. She'll know she's loved." "Every day," Jack promised. "Both of you, every single day." A year later, Ruby stood in her workshop, Clara playing at her feet while she finished Mrs. Patterson's anniversary dress. Through the window, she could see Jack working with a young colt, his movements patient and sure. He'd been right about the horse breeding already. They had 3 mares in foal and orders for the offspring. The letter she'd been writing lay on her cutting table, addressed to an old friend in Missouri. "You asked how I find myself after all that's passed. I hardly know how to answer. The woman who married Eli Mayfield is gone, burned away in crisis and reborn in flame. In her place stands someone I'm still learning to know. A mother, a partner, a woman who creates instead of merely enduring. Jack says we're like this land, harsh winters and scorching summers. But somehow life persists. Seeds find purchase in unlikely ground. Rivers carve new channels through stone. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you find another soul whose scars align with yours in just the right way to make wholeness possible. Clara grows more beautiful daily. She has Jack's dark hair but my stubborn chin. When she laughs, and she laughs often, the whole house fills with light. We're teaching her to be strong but kind, fierce but gentle, to know that survival sometimes requires difficult choices, but that choosing love after loss is the greatest courage of all. I thought my story ended that night on the cliff. Now I know it was just the prologue. The real story began when a weary cowboy made camp on my land and reminded me that broken doesn't mean worthless, that scarred doesn't mean ruined. He kept his promise. He rode 1,000 miles to avoid connection, then stayed to build one. And every night, he sleeps beside me, not the desperate sleep of the hunted, but the peaceful rest of a man who finally found home. As have I. Ruby set down her pen, listening to Clara's babbling and Jack's low whistle as he worked. The afternoon sun slanted through windows Jack had enlarged to let in more light, illuminating bolts of fabric and jewel tones she never would have dared wear in her widow's weeds. Life was not perfect. Some nights, nightmares still came. Some days, the past pressed close. But here in this workshop built from ashes, in this home defended by truth, in this family forged from choice rather than chance, Ruby Mayfield had found something she'd never dared hope for. Not just survival, but joy. Not just endurance, but peace. Not just 1,000 miles behind them, but 1,000 more ahead and someone to ride them with, come storm or shine. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Ruby and Jack's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this story meant to you. If you enjoyed this tale of resilience, redemption, and the courage to love again, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit that like button. And don't forget to press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners who appreciate authentic frontier tales. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own horizons.